Good morning and welcome to the Friday Daytime Show on Indyliveradio. This is Marlene Halliday and I'm here with my colleague Val Gold. We've got three guests. We've got Geraldine Clayton from Divest Strathclyde, who is going to be talking about their campaign to persuade Strathclyde Pension Fund to divest all of its holdings from fossil fuel investments, either direct investments or indirect investments. That's our first guest, that'll be Geraldine. And following Geraldine, we're going to be talking to Ken Andrew. And Ken is a Glasgow City Councillor, and he is one of the councillors who is on the Strathclyde Pension Fund Committee, which has responsibility and oversight for the pension fund and its investment strategy. We talked to Ken about the strategy, how effective it is, what their plans are going forward. Our third guest this morning is Scott Tully of Glasgow Calls Out Polluters. In November this year, Glasgow is going to be host to the UN Climate Conference, COP26. We're talking to Scott about the Glasgow Calls Out Polluters group, what their campaign strategies are, what they're doing just now and what they're hoping to do going forward to November. And here we are with the first interview, Geraldine Clayton of Divest Strathclyde. Good morning everyone, you're listening to Indyliveradio and this is a Friday Daytime Show. This is Marlene Halliday and I'm here with my colleague and good friend Val Gold. And with us for one of this morning's interviews is Geraldine Clayton of Divest Strathclyde. So we'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but just for a bit of background, you're probably well aware that in November this year, Glasgow is going to be hosting the United Nations Climate Conference, usually referred to as COP26 because it's the 26th of these conferences that have happened. All of these COP meetings have been very important over the years, but unfortunately they haven't been very successful in transforming intentions, good intentions, into action. And now we find ourselves at COP26 with even less time to turn around the ongoing increase in carbon emissions that's driving climate warming, climate change all over the planet. One of the main drivers of climate change are the fossil fuel companies. And a recent report called the Carbon Majors Report found that more than half of global industrial emissions since 1988 can be traced to just 25 corporate and state-owned entities. And 1988 is significant because that was the year that the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established. Among the highest emitting investor-owned companies since 1988 are ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, Chevron. And the report shows that if fossil fuels continue to be extracted at the same rate over the next 28 years as they were between 1988 and 2017, then global average temperatures would be on course to rise by 4 degrees by the end of the century. That would have catastrophic consequences, including substantial species extinction and global food chain risks. The current target of the COP meeting is to try and restrict the overall average rise to 1.5 degrees, and even that's looking hard target to achieve. So with that bit of background information, it gets us back to COP26 later on in the year here in Glasgow, and to Geraldine, our guest this morning from Divest Strathclyde. She'll be telling us more about the group, but just a little bit of background information. 7 years ago, a group of Glasgow University students achieved something rather remarkable. They pushed the university to begin divesting from fossil fuels. And that was the first such campaign win in Europe. Divesting from fossil fuels means that the university, whether it's a pension fund or financial investments, they would transfer any investments in fossil fuel companies into other areas. So after that success, that group of students wanted to bring the campaign to the city as a whole, not just the university, and they founded the Strathclyde Pension Divestment Campaign. And the aim of the group is to persuade the trustees of the pension fund to transfer their investments out of any areas that involve fossil fuel companies or fossil fuel related companies, and instead to invest in environmentally friendly sectors. The pension fund was set up back when we still had Strathclyde Regional Council. Of course, that doesn't exist any longer. It's now the responsibility of Glasgow City Council, and they set up a committee of councillors. Those councillors' responsibility is to make sure that the fund is run efficiently, it produces the income they need to be able to pay their members' pensions, and they're also responsible for running it in an environmentally, socially, ethically sound fashion. So, Geraldine, that was a bit of a longer introduction than we usually do for our guests, but I thought it was worthwhile just giving a bit of the bigger planetary context and also the context that you're active in Divest Strathclyde. So, do you want to tell us a bit about how you get involved with the group, and then we can move on to what your current focus is?
I've lived in Glasgow for 40 years, but about 6 years ago, I did move back from England, where I was involved in a fracking campaign in the village very near where I live came from in Lincolnshire originally. And it was a terrible fight. And I mean, we did everything. We took the company through the courts. We lost them a lot of money and a lot of time, but they just kept coming back because of the unfairness of the planning regulations, basically. Anyway, so when I came up here, I thought, what is the best thing that I can do? And then I thought, well, follow the money. As far as all these types of activities are concerned, because I'd seen the way that a lot of companies, operate, and I thought, there's something wrong here. Anyway, so that's how I got involved. Now, I'm not quite sure how long Strathclyde's been going. It started off as Frack Free Glasgow, and then it morphed into Divest Strathclyde, more to do with specifically the pension fund. So they did all this before I moved up. I've been involved in it for about maybe 3 years, about 2.5 years now since I moved back up to Scotland. I am a pension fund member, and I'm a retired member of the pension fund. And what we are fighting for is the fact that the investments from the pension fund are really an absolute stalwart of the industry. They keep them going. Up to now, it's been great for the pension funds. They've been a steady and secure investment, but that shows signs that it's not going to be the case anymore. The Glasgow Strathclyde pension funds invests through direct and through indirect, i.e. pooled investments, a total of around about £509 million in fossil fuels.
Wow.
And some of these companies are the worst performing companies in terms of climate change and environmental damage. The council voted in April for full divestment by 2029, complete divestment, and the process they wanted to start by the time of COP. And this was voted through by 69 votes to 4. But the pension fund committee has the final say on this. And they are saying that they want to decide on the criteria that this will be done on. And so it seems that to us that, there's no clarity about what divestment actually means, although the council has by a very clear majority voted for it. So at the moment, this is our big campaign that we are fighting to say, look, divestment means divestment.
Yes, indeed. So just to ask a question about that. So the pension fund dates back to when we had Strathclyde Regional Council. That's when it all was set up. The Regional Council no longer exists, of course. So
Yeah.
am I right in thinking that the responsibility for running that pension fund now rests with Glasgow City Council? So it's the City Council who voted, sounds like pretty overwhelmingly, to divest it. So the council has voted against it, but the committee that runs it, are the committee, do they run as sort of like trustees of the fund? You know, do they have an inbuilt responsibility to make the fund successful, or as successful as they can?
Yes, they are in charge of it from a financial point of view, and they're very much into what they call their fiduciary duty.
Yes.
Which they and I can understand their point of view. Up till now, the dividends from the oil and gas companies and the coal companies, the fossil fuel companies, have been very good, and the investments have been have been very safe and secure. But this is changing now. For a start, none of the companies, fossil fuel companies, are aligning to the Paris Agreement targets. Their core business model is oil and gas, and they have to do a lot of greenwashing to convince us that that they change. But we've seen a lot of evidence that really they don't intend to change their core business model.
Yeah, and what sort of that 500 500 million, so £500 million invested in directly or indirectly in fossil fuel companies. You've been telling us, Geraldine, that overall the Strathclyde Pension Fund contains about £24 billion worth of investments. So that 500 million, £500 million, that's about, what's that? That's about 2% or so. So it's important, to get that into context. It is just 2% of the pension fund's investments. On the other hand, it is 2%, it's £500 million invested in fossil fuel companies, and it would certainly be good to get that transferred out of that kind of investment for all sorts of reasons. As you say, Geraldine, move somewhere that's better for the environment, but actually, from the point of view of financial responsibility, actually better for the fund as well, because those assets, oil and gas, are becoming what's the value? They're being downrated as a value of assets. So it's not like it is actually a safe investment these days.
Yes, in the short term, oil prices do rise and fall, as we know, but there are growing calls for cuts in carbon emissions. The time of peak oil is just about over. There's going to be rising insurance costs. Drilling is becoming more difficult. For instance, they're having to go into the Arctic, where, for instance, an oil spill in the Arctic would be very, very, even much more serious than it would have been, or than it was in the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico, because at the low temperatures, oil solidifies much quicker, and it's much more difficult to cope with it. So there are growing international legal challenges, but I believe there's around 220 legal challenges across the world on environmental and human rights grounds. And of course, renewables are becoming cheaper. So the companies have all this to contend with.
Can I ask you a question, Geraldine? I note it's quite interesting. I noticed that the Strathclyde Pension Fund is the second largest pension fund in the whole of the UK. I remember, because Strathclyde region used to be, I think it used to be the biggest education authority in Europe. And that was one of the reasons that Margaret Thatcher wanted it disbanded. I think she famously referred to it as monstrosities like Strathclyde. Anyway, What I was going to ask you was, it's interesting actually that from that great big region, which now, which split into lots and lots of smaller authorities, that whole pension fund is now managed by Glasgow City councillors, not anyone from any other councils. But what I was going to ask, well, I just looked at the committee there while we were talking, and it's all the membership of the committee. It's like 8 people, 5 SNP councillors, 1 Labour, 1 Green, and 1 Conservative. Unless I'm misreading it. Anyway, what I was going to ask you was what are the nature of your campaigning activities? Lobbying. Do you mainly campaign towards that committee, and in which case what sort of cooperation and support do you get, or do you also lobby central government with the climate change targets being a big priority for the Scottish government? Have you got a kind of multi-layered approach, or do you focus on one body? That's my question really. Do you lobby central government, or do you mainly concentrate on the pension fund people?
Divest Strathclyde mainly on the Strathclyde Pension Fund, but we have strong links with other groups, like groups that are campaigning across Britain, really, especially say in Edinburgh and the university pension funds. And other pension funds, and also a lot of us have developed wider links with other groups, that are this is quite separate and on an individual basis, but other groups that are campaigning on transport issues or waste, incineration, plastics. The production of plastics is very much and single-use plastics, INEOS and the Mossmore, and all these issues are very, very much linked to the whole oil and gas industry. So although we really do talk very much about the Strathclyde Pension Fund, we do campaign on a wider basis as well.
Well, and that just makes sense, because as you say, all these things are very much interlinked. I mean, you're coming in at the end, it's to do with the capital, where the money comes from. So what do you feel? What were you left feeling yourself when you heard, Glasgow City Council overwhelmingly saying divest the fund, and then the trustees saying, well, what they said, they fair enough, they have actually got the legal responsibility actually if they're trustees. So fair enough that they want to make sure it's done properly. But it sounds, do you think they're sort of hedging a bit? Do you think, were you disappointed in their response?
Well, to be honest, I was a bit confused because you'd have thought it was a done deal. The council, obviously, and the councillors represent the people of Glasgow. So that's the most important thing, and obviously such a big majority. It's very difficult to understand because they're talking about minimum standards without saying what these minimum standards that they're looking for, the criteria that they will invest on or not invest. It could well be, I don't know, is it a way to, is it a form of engagement? Before they've always said, well, if we engage with the fossil fuel companies, then it's a good way to make them change their ways. But of course that never happened. Is it kind of the same thing, this, minimum standards, or I don't know. It's made more difficult by the fact they just had their AGM today on Wednesday. And although I'm a pension fund member, we are not invited. We're not given any notes about the AGM, the agenda. We don't really know what's going on. And this isn't the first year, as long as I've been living up here as a retired pension fund member, we've never been invited to the. I've never been invited to the meetings. So it seems a bit of a democratic deficit as well.
Yes.
So
yes.
there's a lot of things that I find quite confusing actually as a member, and a member who is interested, in it. It's not always. It's a bit opaque sometimes the way it works.
And maybe Val and I should see if we could contact some of the actual trustee council members actually, and get their side of what they're doing. I mean, the thing that struck me was that, I mean, it's years ago now, but I went to a meeting of Divest Strathclyde. It must be 4, 5, 6 years ago, and I ended up writing to my local councillors about the divestment. 2 of them did respond back. One was quite open to the idea. The other one sounded like he wasn't. He gave me a lot of reading material, which was all about how difficult it would be. So maybe, even back then, it could well have been more difficult to know how to go about divesting a big fund like that. But now there's so many, pension funds, university funds that have started divesting, that there must be some good examples of good practice about how to do it. It's not like it's out of the blue and they're being asked to do something no one knows how to do. People have been doing it, isn't it? So it does seem that they could go and, go to another fund, say, how are you doing this? And then start thinking how to apply it to their own investments.
Absolutely. And the pension fund, to be fair, does invest quite a lot in the green economy as well. So it's not, it's not all one way. We just need to nudge them, in that direction, really.
So, should we move on? And here's Glasgow Council looking after a fund that's got £500 million invested in fossil fuels. Can you tell us, have the group got any plans to take advantage of COP26 being in Glasgow this November, the UN climate conference? Do you think that might be a way of putting a wee bit of pressure on the Strathclyde Pension Fund trustees?
Well, we have a meeting every month, sometimes every 2 weeks, and we make the decisions about what we're going to do going forward. COP obviously has been a fantastic opportunity in a way, because it's been delayed. It's been even better because it means that we've had more time to campaign and they've had more time to get their act together.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the COP26 is just now. It's in the background, isn't it? So I mean, presumably the Glasgow City councillors must be well aware of that. And hopefully that's going to, give it the voices that want to make changes have a bit more kind of edge to it.
Well, obviously the world is watching, and Glasgow knows that the world is watching. So yes, we are a small campaign. And we give our time freely, and write and campaign. So there's only a limited amount of things that we can do, but we really want people to look at our website, to look us up, and we have got an open letter that we want people to sign for us. So by looking up Divest Strathclyde, you can have a look at the open letter, and that's going to be sent to the committee. So that's a very important thing that we're concentrating on, and just keep at it, really. So today we had an action in front of the city halls to emphasize the fact that the AGM was going ahead, and to try and publicize it, try and really make people aware all the time that this is a big issue, and it's a very important issue what the pension funds are doing, and it's going to make a big difference. Yes,
indeed. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? It's like those of us who are involved in campaigning, some of us, I can think of friends of mine, and what they really like is being out on the street, whether it's on a stall or holding a placard, engaging complete strangers in conversations. And I can do that, but pushes up against my comfort zone to do it. And then others of us, more like me, are really, really at home with online meetings and making contact in that. So I noticed, I was having a look through the website and the blog, and I noticed that you've already been taking part in something that was called, what was it again? Oh yes, COP26 Coalition's Global Gathering. On your website, what it says is that Divest Strathclyde held a session, or were part of a session in this global COP22 coalition, which looked at how Scottish pension funds investment are financing climate breakdown. And then the climate breakdown has impacts on Indigenous communities, for example, in Latin America. And then part of that session, you had some people from those communities speaking back and saying how their communities and their nations are being affected by the kind of investments that are being made by the Strathclyde Pension Fund. And that struck me as being a really powerful connection to make for people, because it can sound a bit abstract, Strathclyde Pension Fund and investment and fiduciary responsibility, but it's not so abstract when it's someone sitting there telling you how that's affecting themselves and their communities.
But then, of course, the Committee on Climate Change, which is the government's own appointed body on these sorts of issues, issued a report, I think it's this very week, saying the UK is shockingly unprepared for dealing with the effects of climate change. We're already seeing it. I mean, are we this side or that side of the Gulf Stream? The more and more extreme weather events we're seeing, either very wet or very dry. We're beginning to see these things here, we can't be, and the way it's affecting nature and the wildlife. As well, and also, the pollution, it's all affecting us a lot more than we
indeed. And it's a bit ironic, isn't it? Because here's the three of us sitting in the country that's got massive renewable resources, Scotland. Yes. I mean, a high proportion of European renewable sources are all either in Scottish waters or Scottish land mass. So it is ironic that we're in this situation still.
Yes, that's such a good point. We are the envy of Europe for our natural resources, and the Scottish government is doing a lot. But I think there's a lot more that could be done. Also, of course, energy efficiency. That's kind of fallen off the radar a bit, but that's just as important.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot going for us, and Scotland's got a lot going for it, with this green future, and of course jobs. A green transition would be fantastic for jobs as well. Given the right policies, 3 times as many jobs would be created in the green economy for every job currently held in the oil and gas sector. So it makes sense on every level.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, Geraldine, are there any other areas that you think are areas of concern? For example, I know that some pension funds invest in companies that manufacture arms and so on.
Yes.
Is that something that Strathclyde have now disassociated themselves from, or are there any other areas that you're aware of?
I'm not sure. The arms industry is the obvious one, and trident replacement.
Yeah. So, Luke, we just want to thank you. We just want to thank you very much for coming on to talk to us. Really appreciate that you've done that, and especially as Val and I know you've been suffering from a wee bit of a cold of late. So thanks very much for coming on, Geraldine. And we just want to wish you well with that campaign, because it's a really, really valuable campaign to take forward. Thank you again.
You're listening to Indyliveradio on Friday the 2nd of July. That was an interview that we recorded earlier this week, Marlene Halliday and myself, Valerie Gold, with Geraldine Clayton from the campaigning group Divest Strathclyde.
Indyliveradio.
So you're now going to hear from Councillor Ken Andrew, who sits on the Strathclyde Pension Fund Management Committee. Welcome to another edition of the Indyliveradio Friday show, and my name's Valerie Gold, and I'm here with my co-presenter Marlene Halliday.
Good morning, everyone.
And we're delighted to welcome a guest, Councillor Ken Andrew from Glasgow City Council. Ken is one of the councillors for Ward 11, Hillhead, that's my own ward, and he is has been a councillor for the SNP there for almost 10 years now. And today we're talking to Ken in his capacity as one of the members of the Strathclyde Pension Fund Committee. Hello, Ken.
Hi there.
Hi, it's nice to see you, and we know you're beginning to wind down for the summer now, but nevertheless, going into recess, but nevertheless, we're very grateful to you because we know how busy you are, so thanks for giving us your time today. So I'm going to pass over to Marlene to start off with some questions about this topic, Ken.
Okay.
Right, good. Yeah, so good to meet you, Ken, and yeah, as Val's just said, I really appreciate you coming on the programme. So this last week or two, Val and I have done some interviews with campaigning groups in Glasgow that are just beginning to focus on, the UN Climate Convention that's coming up, COP26. It's going to be in Glasgow in November, having been postponed for a year. And so there's various things that they're campaigning on, but there's one group that campaigns on a bit more specifically about the Strathclyde Pension Fund, and in particular just pushing a bit to, as far as is possible, to get that fund to divest from any investments that are directly or indirectly dependent on fossil fuels. So that would be one thing, not the only thing, that would be one thing actually to talk to you about. So could we just kick off, could you give us a wee potted history about this Strathclyde Pension Fund and, how come Glasgow City Council is running it?
That's probably a much bigger question, but I think the Strathclyde Pension Fund, I think it goes back to about the 1970s with the old Unitary Authority, the old Strathclyde region, and I think there was a whole number of different small pension funds that were all brought together to form this much bigger fund, what is now the Strathclyde Pension Fund. The strength of that being that the bigger the fund, the more it's able to max out its ability to invest and find investment opportunities. I suppose the thing I should also say, though, is as a member of the Pension Fund Committee, I do have a fiduciary duty to ensure that the pension fund remains solvent, certainly, able to pay current pensioners and able to have reserves such that future pensioners will also be able to receive a pension. So in some respects, we're very controlled by that fiduciary duty to always be seeking to find investments of best value. So I think that's probably the initial point in terms of the fund. I suppose the bigger point is that the Strathclyde Pension Fund is, I believe it's the second biggest pension fund in the United Kingdom now. Its values, I think only Birmingham's fund is bigger. So the Strathclyde Pension Fund at its latest valuation has something like £26.3 billion in investments, which is a pretty extraordinary sum. But as I've already said, we at that, it's sitting at something like, in its actuarial valuation, it's about 126% of where it needs to be. It needs to be at least at 100% to cover current pensioners and forthcoming pensioners. We've had a very, very strong year. So we're currently sitting at something like 126%. But in terms of investment, of course, you'll understand this, that, well, you can have some stellar years, which we've just had. We need those stellar years to balance out the years where stock markets absolutely crashed, the 2008s, the dot-com bubbles, So while it sounds as if we have lots of opportunities to move funds around or whatever because of how well funded it appears at the moment, we need that. We need the peaks to make up for the troughs.
Yes, I'm sure, and I mean I'm well aware that, you know, for you and the other councillors on that committee, it's quite a weight of a responsibility. I mean, you're talked about it in terms of fiduciary responsibility, and it is, because, you know, you've got, I don't know how many people depend on that fund to get their pension arriving in their bank account every month, but it must be in I don't know, it might be tens of thousands, I presume. But
I didn't do my homework, Marlene. I apologise.
Well, neither did I.
I actually do have that number, but unfortunately, it's in my council laptop and in some papers, and you'd get very bored waiting for me to boot that up to find the number. But fine. It certainly runs to tens of thousands.
Yes, I'm sure it does. Yeah.
I'm sure. Tens of thousands of current pensioners, or probably the thousands of those that have their pension in suspension. So that's those that have been a member but then have left another job but left the pension, and then those that are currently members of the pension fund that will be expecting their pension to be paid, and again that runs to tens of thousands. You know, so you know, in terms of Strathclyde, of course, that covers the Glasgow area, Eastern Bartonshire, Western Bartonshire, Renfrewshires, whatever. So, you know, and that's just within the council. Then there's colleges, universities, fire brigade, etc., etc. Lots
of people. Lots of jobs that were, as you say, over the old Strathclyde region. And to declare an interest, I'm married to one of those tens of thousands, so I have a vested interest in his pension arriving in his bank account every month. So just to go back, just about rather of things we want to talk to you, but. Just to pick up on the point about, you know, how easy or not, or how willing or not it is to divest from funds that are dependent on fossil fuels. I mean, 500 million, so £500 million, is regularly quoted by campaign groups as being the amount of investment that the Strathclyde Pension Fund has invested. I mean, it won't be all directly, some of it will be indirectly, but in funds that benefit from fossil fuel industries. So you can tell us in a minute if that figure is accurate, but just to put it into perspective, if that's correct, that would be maybe about 2% of the total funds that you hold, I think, something like that. So
I think currently we're somewhere less than 1%.
Right.
I believe it's something like about half of 1% are in fossil fuel companies, if you like. I suppose, though, what I should say is that a lot of the fossil fuel companies, and they're not all the same, but many of them are now beginning to divest from the traditional role of drilling for oil. I should also make it clear we have absolutely no investments in coal mining. We have no money invested in coal mining at all.
Is that the same for arms as well, Ken? For arms companies, or?
We are. I believe we're something like A-rated as an ethical investor.
That's excellent.
However, and here's the thing, and you'll immediately understand this, that I can think of one company, and I don't think I'm giving too much away, it's a worldwide company, Hewlett Packard.
Mm-hmm.
Probably your printer's made by them, or maybe your laptop.
Yeah.
I mean, they're a huge American company, manufacturer of microchips, whatever. And not terribly long ago, it was being demanded that we divest from some holdings we had in Hewlett Packard, because a chip that Hewlett Packard make ended up in Israeli, what's the word? Surveillance.
Mm.
Thank you, Val. Surveillance equipment.
Right.
Now, it's absolutely true, but I mean, that is the global nature of this world. And if you dug far enough into almost any investment, you might eventually get to somewhere where you don't want to see us investing in. But the very same people that might be complaining about that investment have probably printed off their leaflet on their Hewlett Packard printer, or written me the email on that device, or even they might not know it, but it might well be inside the device that says Lenovo. It could be a Hewlett Packard chip inside it.
Yeah.
It's everything, so it's not absolutely straightforward. In terms of the divestment from fossil fuels, as I said, a lot of the fossil fuel companies are now, Shell are rebranding themselves as an energy company. They're actually getting away from, even calling themselves an oil company. Now, that might be a bit of greenwashing. I can accept that, you could be slightly cynical about that. But the reality is, for a company like Shell or BP or any of these companies, they're looking. They can see the writing on the wall for oil extraction as a business model going forward. So they are starting to look at other business opportunities away from oil extraction, because oil extraction is not going to be the, if you like, super profitable enterprise it once was. It is going to become on the margins.
And I believe
it's going to happen.
I believe your committee has recently made a statement, just very recently, that this pressure group have praised as a positive step that the committee have committed to assess the climate credentials of the companies they invest in, and to divest from companies which, in inverted commas, don't take the responsibility on carbon or climate seriously. So it's clear that you've got a very difficult role. You've got this massive amount of money on your shoulders, but you have to balance your fiduciary responsibilities with the ethical side. So you're sort of, by the way, just on the numbers that we mentioned earlier, I have actually found them here. So it is a huge amount. 94,000 active members of the scheme, of which 74,000 are pensioners and 53,000 are deferred members.
Yeah, that's good to know.
Like I used to work for Glasgow City Council, but as a teacher, my pension comes from the SPPA, which also covers the police as well, I think. But I do think that Glasgow City Council still has to pay some of that. The Strathclyde Fund pays a bit of some teachers who have got enhancements. I think that comes from the council, doesn't it? So
I believe it does, Val.
Yeah, and that's quite a lot of people, anybody who got a deal with an enhancement. Anyway, I digress. So,
it's interesting, because raising that point about your responsibility to make sure that you're running the fund as effectively as possible. As you said earlier, you do need to have good years where you have be creating more income than you need, so as to balance the bad years. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because, I'm sure that in the past, companies like BP, Shell, Exxon, have been good investments. I'm sure they've produced a good return on the investment. They're also, though, that set of about 25 companies that produce out of all proportion amount of, have produced in the past, and out of all proportion amount of carbon emissions. So you've got those two things together. And then now those companies' assets, I mean, part of those companies' assets is what's in the ground underneath their oil wells. But if your assets crash, if your assets become, less and less rated, then actually at that point, they're not a good investment. I mean, it's not a good investment to have money in a company whose assets have crashed. So does that make the kind of decisions about where to put the money a bit easier in a way these days than maybe it was 6-7 years back?
I think there's an element of that, Marlene. Clearly that there can be an issue where you end up with a frozen asset, that it becomes almost useless, because of the nature of what it was. Like, it's always the curious one that was oft quoted, although it's not as germane now, but Nokia started off making cartwheels.
Really?
And, yes, they were a Finnish cartwheel company.
Wow.
And you could have ended up holding stock or equity in Nokia making cartwheels. Now, they decided at one point to then, however circuitously, get to mobile phones. And that is potentially where some of these, if you like, oil companies are potentially going. They are going to leave that, and eventually these assets, like what's under the ground, they'll not pump it because it'll be making them no money.
Yeah.
I think there's the other point to make.
Happening, Ken, isn't it? Sorry to interrupt. That's already happening in the North Sea, because my who works, he's an engineer, a senior engineer with an international oil company, and he says that the reason it's so quiet is because the companies are going to other places in the world where the oil is easier to get out, whereas there is oil in the North Sea, but it's more difficult to extract. So sorry for interrupting you. But
No. I mean the oil companies at the moment, it's effectively a economical view they take. What is the current price per barrel? What is the price per barrel to get it out of the North Sea? Is there somewhere cheaper? And even if we do pump that, I mean, it's the amount. The more they pump, the more the price will go down. Whatever.
Yeah.
I also had a conversation with a guy from one of our investment managers, an English gentleman, but we were speaking via Zoom to him in New York, and I asked him the question. I said, "How much of the oil that we're pumping actually ends up in in our cars as petrol or diesel, or as heavy fuel in ships and whatever?" And he said that's one of the things they've always tried to work out, and it's not an easy calculation. What fraction, if you remember your chemistry, and fractions of oil, ends up, being burnt, because while we almost certainly were going to be moving to stopping burning fossil fuels, it may still, almost certainly for a period anyway, will be economical to actually take oil out of the ground for the plastics industry, which is an enormous, virtually everything, we're sitting around has come from under the ground to form plastics. And no one's suggesting that the plastics industry is going to go away, or no one's suggesting we go back to Bakelite, which probably arguably is I can't quite remember the process for making Bakelite, but I'm sure it's not very earth friendly either.
Sorry, you go on.
No, I'm just saying, I think there are some of these kind of nuances in there, in terms of pulling some of these assets out the ground, and are we necessarily, doing bad stuff with them? mean, clearly a lot of it goes into the chemical industry, and a lot of those chemicals are used in pharmaceuticals, for instance.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
so we have to try and think a bit more broadly, and I'm reasonably certain that the pressure to just stop burning these fuels is just going to ramp up and up, and certainly our investment in these oil giants, if you like, you know, we'll continue to look very closely at.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. It does have to be a nuanced discussion about that industry, because obviously, you know, there are some parts of it, and you mentioned pharmaceuticals. That's an obvious one. We need that. And if you need, you know, organic material that to begin with you get from an oil well, and then you start, making other things from it, then I don't think anyone's arguing against that. I mean, plastics, I think actually there's quite a few people that think the plastics industry really needs to, make itself a lot more environmentally friendly. That's going to, disappear. So just to going back to the committee that you're on, recently there was a vote in Glasgow City Council as a whole that was, it came out very, very heavily in favour of divesting from investments. I think there was only four councillors who voted against it. But, as we've been saying, it's your committee who have the responsibility, and it is a very big responsibility. So how does it work? Do you have to put that council vote into action, or do you still retain a measure of independence from that?
We do have a level of independence. And as I said, given our fiduciary duty and the fact that was Glasgow City Council made, if you like, came up with that motion, but we run the pension fund for lots of other groups and other councils and whatever who didn't make that vote. So, and that's, I am fudging it a wee bit, and I do accept that. But what we are looking at though is we're looking very closely at how some other funds are divesting and divesting appropriately, because the very last thing you would ever want to do is be slapdash around investment, because markets can get spooked. You could end up doing all sorts of damage and unintended consequences of your actions. So we have to be very careful about that. We are currently we're trying to speak with the pension fund, the New York Pension Fund, which is recognised as a world leader in how it's managed its ethical policies and its policies of divestment out of things like fossil fuels and mining and whatever. So we of course, the New York Fund and any fund will be slightly secretive about how it does its business, because that effectively gives it an advantage in the markets.
Yeah, of course.
Because of the way it invests. So they're not just going to say, "Oh, here you are, guys. Here's how to do it." Not least when you see that the cost of managerial, investment managers and advisors, that we pay, when we've got a £26.3 billion fund, we pay a lot for these guys. These guys get paid extraordinary sums of money to do what they do.
Yeah.
But we are talking with the New York Fund to try and get to produce, if you like, an ethical protocol that we can be appropriately signed up to, so that we can start saying, well, in terms of the motion in council to divest from funds, that's how we'll manage that. I think the other thing to say though is that when we have divest Strathclyde and they're saying get out of these funds, and that's fine, but effectively, Strathclyde could say, right, we're going to sell off our £250 million worth of that stock, and then a bad guy like me comes along, say, oh, well, you know, that's going cheap on the market, and I buy it up. But I have no good environmental credentials or thoughts other than profit. Profit's the only thing that motivates me, and I then just let those companies behave in whichever egregious way they choose.
Yes, I've heard that argument made. You know, that it's the argument that a big investor can influence how a fund is managed to make it more environmentally friendly.
We are doing that, Marlene. We are speaking with those companies and saying, where are you going with this? We've got a climate emergency. How are you managing this? And so we are trying. You know, we are not trying. We are influencing these companies. And all the investment managers are doing that. They're all speaking with companies they own, and you know, basically saying, you know, you need to change here, guys. You know, I don't want to hold this investment and watch it just become stranded.
Yeah. Yes, of course. That's it. That's what affects everyone, isn't it? Stranded assets. And I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the sort of you mentioned the New York City fund, because I was thinking that these days now there are examples of other funds that have maybe a bit further ahead than you are in terms of divesting, and I've got a good experience of. So it must be capable of like following, maybe not in footsteps, but you know, getting an example of that. Yeah. So if I just ask a bit of a wider question, because you know, even for small investors, I mean, like an individual person, maybe someone with, you know, I don't know, a stocks and shares ISA or something, and £1,000 to put in. It's not that it's possible, but it's not that easy to find non-fossil fuel reliant funds for small investors. So it must be more of a problem in some respects when it's a big investor like yourselves. So it's not a few thousand you're putting in, you know, you're looking for a fund that kind of. So do you think that the financial services industry is itself being, you know, nimble enough to provide you with the kind of investment opportunities, non-fossil fuel ones, that you need?
I think that was an interesting use of words there, Marlene, like nimble, you know, and a pension fund, because pension funds are very long.
You know,
you're looking at very long term, and quick chops and changes do not suit big pension funds like that.
Like a huge one of these massive big tankers that takes compared to like a wee speedboat.
Basically, that's it. I mean, there are some guys that will be investing and being very active players in stock markets, you know, buying and selling. These guys, you know, hedge fund managers and whatever, that are, you know, buying relative to like pension funds, relatively small amounts of stock, hedging other stocks, etc., to play one off it, you know, pay Peter to, you know, rob Paul or whatever it is these guys do. Yeah. For the pension funds, that's just not our game. It's just, you know, it's very, very long-term thinking, and so.
But you don't really have long-term now. No one has long-term left now to think about where this planet's going in terms of climate emergency. I mean, we used to talk about climate change and now climate emergency is probably, you know, the kind of least worrying phrase that gets used. So fair enough, you do have short-term and long-term investments. I was more thinking about, you know, if you go houses and say we want to put X million pounds into something that isn't fossil fuel dependent, I mean, are they really able to points that are big enough to take that measure of investment?
I mean, our holdings are across so many different asset classes, Marlene. It's, you know, I mean, it's in you know, we have property assets, we have, land holdings, we have, we virtually every asset class you could imagine, because the whole, it's about a balanced portfolio. But, some of the things that don't ever get kind of mentioned is, for instance, our direct investment portfolio, where we have huge amounts of money. Really big parts of the fund are invested directly in things like wind farms and things like that. Which so we are investing in if you like, long-term projects that, in terms of return, we may well be putting hundreds of millions into some of our direct investment portfolio in the expectation that we'll not actually see returns for 10 years. That the cash flow that comes from that is likely to be very strong at once you've got over that sort of initial cost period. So we are doing there's lots of stuff does happen in terms of the investment fund. As I said, the investment in the fossil fuel companies is a relatively small part of our portfolio. I suppose, though, just to be kind of, to be fair and honest, that one of the things that generally the fossil fuel companies have always been good for is they've always paid very strong dividends. Regular, strong dividends. And for the pension fund, when you're having your peaks and troughs, that can really help your treasury management, because there is a strong dividend payment that can help pay the pensions. If you are because you do, or it can help with the treasury management of paying the pensions, that strong dividend stream. And that is what, and I think the pension fund managers would concede that point, but they would also say they're looking at other asset classes where they can get that same regular, strong dividend stream to help with treasury management. And again, that's just that smoothing process between the employee contributions, employer contributions, and then dividend to pay the pensions.
And whatever it's been in the past in terms of providing you with that kind of not guaranteed but safe investment. Obviously, if you're down now to 0.5, would you say? No, 1%. 1%. I mean, that's not a significant part of your holdings.
No, it's not. I mean, it has become and has been progressively just getting smaller and smaller. Because we know that that's not particularly a good investment. We know we have this climate emergency. Why, So I mean, for instance, in like deep coal mining, or in fact any coal mining, we are completely divested from that. We hold no stocks in coal mining.
Yeah, good.
It's gone.
Wow, I think you've got a question.
I just wanted to ask you, just like from a personal point of view, Ken, I mean, this is only one of your responsibilities as a councillor, and I know that, the responsibilities of a city councillor are quite varied and onerous. I'm just thinking, this huge amount of money and massive responsibility for paying the pensions of thousands of folk, that must sit quite heavy on your shoulders. Does it how do you cope with that kind of responsibility? Is it something that weighs heavy on your shoulders, or do you manage fine?
I think I'd be lying to say I'm losing sleep at night about it. What I would say is that I have huge confidence in the professionalism of the managers of the pension fund. It's a very, very professional and well-run organisation, and they use external investment advice and managers from a huge number of companies to manage some of our investments. And if you look at our portfolio of assets and different asset managers, It's a hugely complex business.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
As such, I suppose, as committee members, I mean, I take my responsibility very seriously. All my responsibilities very seriously. But there's something about, leaving this hugely complex matter to the professionals. But by the same token, as much as possible, ask the sensible questions and try and, make sure that we are scrutinising how they manage this, and that's both in terms of their ability to pay pensions now, in the future, but equally look after the planet. That is
indeed. Indeed. I was thinking that actually as well, that obviously part of your job is to make sure that the fund's being managed effectively and coming up with the income it needs. But I think from the point of view of the councillors there, you've also got and it sounds like you're well aware of this, but you've also got a moral responsibility to align the pension fund with the needs of the planet, its climate, and I mean, actually, eventually, its ability to support the kind of life that we enjoy on it at the moment. So it's quite a task.
Yeah.
So just to finish off, so COP26 is coming up in, I think it's just 5 months now. It's going to be here in Glasgow in November. So, there's the world coming to Glasgow to try and to wrench our world economy away from its current, so dependency, carbon emissions. So there's no direct link between the Strathclyde Pension Fund and COP26, but symbolically, perhaps, is that COP26? Do you feel that as a significant moment for yourselves and your stewardship of the fund?
I mean, I think certainly coming up to COP26, I mean, I would like to hope that we will have perhaps clarified, our investment protocol by then. I would like to think that we would have, depending if New York Pension Fund are prepared to share some of their advice with us, and to be fair to Americans, they're nearly always incredibly generous with their intellectual property. So, but I think, that would be something that I would like to think that we've got an ambition to get to a point, prior to COP26 where we can say, actually, we've signed up to this protocol in terms of, our investment strategies. I think one of the things that almost certainly we'll do is we will, if you like, climate assess every investment. Prior to getting into investments, that one of the things we'll all be looking at is what is its environmental impact. So so there'll be an environmental impact assessments on all our assets before we invest in them, and those that we currently hold, what is their current environmental impact? Is it negative? In which case, what are we doing about it? Are we going to start, looking at other investment classes, to come out of that? Or are we asking those investment managers that have advised that, are they going and saying to the executive management of those companies, right, you need to clean up your act or whatever? And that again is the point, that if you simply divest and those shares get held in terms of some of the perhaps big insurers or whatever that are more inclined to just raw performance rather than ethical good, you lose that lever of control.
Yes,
and I think we actually have quite a strong lever of control.
Yeah, and I mean, who knows? I mean, maybe hopefully COP26 will, have some concrete achievements that it comes up with for countries to sign up with, and maybe that presumably that can have an impact on your actions going forward.
Absolutely.
I think we'll need to stop there. It's just been fascinating talking to you, Ken. I just really appreciate you, giving up a bit of your time today to come and chat to us. But I think, Val, you shall we finish there? And
yeah, I do have one last question, Ken, about bins, but I think I'll keep that for another day. I know that's your favourite subject.
Oh yeah, I love that. Yeah, I have a level of expertise in that as well.
So thanks very much, from the sublime to the ridiculous. Thank you very much indeed, Ken.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Welcome back, everyone. We're carrying on today's theme on the climate emergency, and we're now with our third guest of the morning, who is Scott Tully from Glasgow Calls Out Polluters. Scott, thanks very much for being prepared to come and chat to us. Really appreciate that.
No worries at all. It's lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Good. So for anyone who's just tuned in, hasn't heard the previous two guests, the UN Climate Conference, COP26, is here in Glasgow in November, so in just 5 months' time. And at that point, climate negotiators from all over the world will be trying to get governments to act on their promises, because there is already a climate agreement that most countries have signed up to, but most governments haven't done enough to back up that agreement with action, and time's running out. You only have to look at the news this week from Western Canada and Western states of the US to see the kind of weather patterns that are becoming to be common in regions where they were once a rarity. So there's no doubt that COP26 is going to be crucial in wrenching governments towards stepping up their efforts to combat the climate emergency. So, Scott, there's a lot at stake. Can you tell us more about that, and in particular what your group are doing?
Yeah, of course. And I'm going to apologise by starting with an acronym, but like the kind of COP process is kind of laden with acronyms, which is one of the ways in which it can be sometimes a little bit kind of alienating for ordinary people. But basically COP stands for Conference of the Parties. And, you know, parties are basically nation states. So what we've got coming to Glasgow are, I think, 197 nation states coming to Glasgow to like collectively negotiate on aspects of climate policy. As you kind of just touched on there, Marlene, like the Paris Agreement is like quite central to that as well. So the Paris Agreement was this kind of big agreement in 2015 to keep global temperatures keep a global temperature rise to no more than 2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels, with a kind of aim towards keeping it to 1.5. But as you also pointed out, no one is even close to getting anyone near being kind of Paris compliant in terms of their emission reductions. We are a million miles away from any sort of like sensible climate that is not deadly for human life. And like you said, we're kind of seeing the consequences as we speak. Yeah. So like one of the reasons that like the Paris Agreement hasn't really worked is because it's non-binding. So like when they agreed it, they didn't actually agree. They agreed that the Paris Agreement was basically a good idea, but they didn't like agree on like any formal mechanism to make it happen. And of course, like no surprises for guessing what's happened now, not much climate action. So one of the reasons that it's non-binding, one is partly like the United States, who are not always a good actor in the kind of in the international climate scene.
Yeah, especially the last 4 years.
Yeah, but we should also remember that historically they've been a pretty poor actor across the board. This has been like the worst period of their kind of climate diplomacy, but it's always been pretty poor. But yeah, one reason as well is that I guess putting like binding emission reductions kind of conflicts with the kind of the political zeitgeist of power, of kind of corporate power for big polluters, for want of a better way of putting it, you know. So we have like outsourced a lot of political responsibility to like corporations and big polluting companies with the kind of, I would say a very naive, if I'm being kind, a very naive assumption that these people can sort out the climate emergency themselves. But of course, what these people have been doing is continuing with business as usual. So us at Glasgow Calls Out Polluters are kind of organising roughly around the issue of big polluters at COP. So this has been like a major sticking point for years at COP. The presence of big polluting companies, their kind of lobby and influence. They've even wrote some of the worst parts of the Paris Agreement. A Shell executive was caught bragging that he wrote the kind of straw proposal for it. So when I guess a climate conference kind of lands in your city, and it's very weird that it's kind of landed in Glasgow in a sense, it's kind of surreal that something this big is landing here. Although of course there's historical reasons why a country like the UK has been chosen. But I think we have like a responsibility to like act in solidarity with those on the front line fighting the climate crisis. Yep. So all these kind of lobbyists and kind of business types who we are holding responsible for the climate crisis come into Glasgow, we're going to do what we can to lessen their influence and presence over the climate talks.
But I was wondering just if for some of our listeners that are maybe not aware of your organisation, Glasgow Calls Out Polluters, which really is a great thing to be in existence at this crucial stage. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about the background to the organisation and your campaigning group. You know, how long has it been in existence? When did you start, and how did you get the sort of motivation to begin?
Yeah, totally. A lot of places it kind of came out of. It broadly came out of like the divestment movement. I know I think you're speaking to Geraldine from Divest Strathclyde. Yeah. So like this kind of movement to, shift public funds away from big polluting companies. So when the news kind of emerged that COP26 was coming to the UK, Scotland, and more specifically to Glasgow, like for people like myself and a few others, it wasn't too much of a leap to probably start applying like the same sort of principles to the COP, and if that makes sense, like these kind of anti-corporate principles, and trying to like shift the public acceptance of big polluting companies and the kind of deference that our public institutions have to big polluting companies. So I think in theory we kind of started at about December 2019, we ran a kind of workshop, and I think I ran it, and I was gently encouraged by like a few allies just to kind of do this and try and set up something in around Glasgow. And from there, it's kind of just developed. We obviously we had this sort of thing where the COP was supposed to be 2020, right? It was supposed to be in November, so it was quite hard to like anticipate and plan ahead in a sense. So I think we kind of gave ourselves the name Glasgow Calls Out Polluters because we were kind of like, we weren't sure if the COP was going ahead firstly, so we didn't want to have like a name that was specifically COP, if that makes sense. Then all the organising work was kind of in futility, and we kind of broadened out as well to try and like influence some of the climate debate in Scotland and beyond with things like the Polluter Awards, which I can talk about later on as well. So yeah, it's just been kind of developing from there really. We're kind of roughly Glasgow based, but not even. Like we've got somebody from like Brussels as part of our organising group. We've got people from London as well, and we're quite well plugged in with like lots of other groups across the UK, Europe, and across the globe that are also kind of involved in this kind of struggle. So it's simultaneously kind of Glasgow focused, and we're trying to like bring that kind of Glasgow focus to like this kind of fight to kick polluters out and use it as well to influence politics in Scotland and beyond. But also, we're kind of connected kind of globally as well, which is, we're trying to keep a good balance between the two.
So, tell us some of the things that you're up to. I had a wee look at your website, and I think there's a letter that you've written to Alok Sharma. Now he's actually the president of the meeting, isn't he? I think presumably that's on behalf of the UK government, but it's not a UK government event; it's a UN event, isn't it?
It's a UN event, but like as like when you're right, the UK are the president, and like with that comes like a little bit of like low level agenda setting power, which we can like maybe get into a little bit later on, because the UK government can kind of bring their own agenda and their own kind of ideas around climate to the forefront. But we sent an open letter to Alok Sharma, who is the president of COP26. I think it's signed by over 240 groups from across the world. But it also kind of speaks towards what I was talking about earlier in terms of like the global kind of appeal, and it's been a global issue for years, so it's been something that we're just helping to like carry forward as much as we can, being in Glasgow. But there's like quite a lot of global interest in this issue. So yeah, there's 5 demands there, which are basically for him to use his power as president to lessen or make moves to lessen the presence of big polluters at COP26. So that includes not giving any UK passes to big polluters. That includes not giving any sponsorship to big polluters. Well, he's already failed there. Rejecting false solutions to the climate crisis, a very important issue. Big polluters are determined to push forward very speculative solutions that literally don't work yet, which is just a wild gamble to place on the climate crisis. Things like carbon capture and storage. Listen, there's an argument that we should be thinking about it.
Yeah.
We should not be predicating like emissions reductions on it because it's so unlikely to work. Yeah. So we asked him to reject that. 4th, and perhaps the central one, which is the one that people have been pushing for ages, is to push for a conflict of interest policy. So the World Health Organization, they have a conflict of interest policy that means that big tobacco companies can't be present in World Health talks because they are a vested interest whose private profits are dependent on poor health outcomes. It's a conflict of interest. It's not fair to have them at the debate. And we are saying that the same principle, the same very sensible principle should be applied to the presence of big polluters. And the 5th one, and it's a big issue as well, particularly because of like the kind of vaccine politics that are emerging, is to like deliver climate justice and make sure that voices on the front line are centred. People like Alok Sharma will pay lip service to it, but he'll do very little of substance. Now, we did actually meet Alok Sharma around this. We got a meeting with him, a 30-minute meeting.
Wow.
I know. A full 30 minutes, which, to be honest, I was pleasantly surprised at, in the sense that like I had low expectations. So that followed us launching the open letter, and then we did like a kind of an internet meme action. We got lots of people to like send like internet memes to Alok Sharma. That and a few phone calls to his office managed to get us an interview in a 30-minute slot with him.
Yeah.
Unsurprisingly, his position is like not very good on these. He's basically, I would describe him as somebody who is afraid to take responsibility and make a political stand against the presence of big polluting companies. And that's kind of in keeping with our politics over the last 30 or 40 years. We've outsourced a lot of power to kind of private corporate actors, and kind of Alok Sharma is just kind of in keeping with that tradition, really.
Yeah.
I was just reading your open letter, which is really impressive with these 5 points, and it's really amazing that you've got, have you met with any resistance, from other organisations or anybody trying to block your activities?
Apart from the COP president, no. I don't think a great deal. I mean, you get like, I think it's more that some people aren't maybe so interested in like that sort of activity, and you get like the odd people on Twitter giving you the, oh well, why don't we just engage with these big polluters and talk to them, and then they might like see sense. That's a common rejoinder you get on Twitter, and of course, like I would argue that we've been doing that for 40 years, and look where we are. But honestly, like not too much resistance, and I think to a certain extent, like it kind of speaks towards just how this isn't actually, in my opinion, a very radical demand, right? It's radical in the context of a politics that outsources responsibility to like corporations because you're challenging them, but in the sense that these guys are a clear conflict of interest, like it's actually quite sensible, and I think it's quite easy for people to understand.
Yeah. It's, especially when it's a good comparison to make with the tobacco companies, isn't it? Because well, certainly people my age, but even a bit younger, we're well aware. Remember all the kind of hassle and lobbying that went on. Actually, some of it quite dishonestly from those tobacco companies. To stop bringing in, like warnings on the side of the package, things that we just take for granted now. but that took years and years and years. So I think that's quite a good, example to sort of use, because I'm sure the same thing's happening with the big oil and gas companies. So that was good hearing a bit about the background to the group, and there's obviously things you've got going on, actions that you've got going through the website. So should we talk a bit about some of those? Because there's ones about the Scotland Polluter Award. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the Scottish Polluter Awards. Yeah, we've got the Scottish Polluter Awards and the UK Polluter Awards. Yeah. So we've broadened out, so I guess it was kind of, this was partly because I guess it was during lockdown, right? So like something we are thinking about doing is doing a lot of tours around Glasgow, toxic tours, where we kind of take people around sites of kind of pollution in Scotland and just do a bit of storytelling and a bit of social history as well. And it's a kind of good way to engage international guests as well. But yeah, lockdown happens right in March 2020, and we're all inside, and a lot of people were on furlough and stuff, and had a bit of time in their hands. So we just spent the time just kind of learning about doing that kind of work that we needed to do for the kind of toxic tour there and then. And then we're like, what do we do with all this information? And we're like, why don't we just run some awards? Because something that we are quite keen on challenging is this kind of notion, particularly in Scotland, that Scotland's a climate leader. It's said an awful lot, and we would say that it's definitely not the case. So we kind of use that as a way to kind of poke fun, but challenge that in a kind of fun way. So we've got for example, the North Sea Numpty Award, which is quite telling again, because the North Sea is I think it's Europe's biggest kind of continental shelf of oil, one of the biggest sites of oil extraction anyway across Europe, and most definitely is radically adding to the climate crisis.
I quite like the way you phrase it. I like your terminology. If you just read it a wee bit from your website, and just to let any listeners know that if they want to go onto your website, Glasgow Calls Out Polluters, they can vote in the polluter profiles category. Yeah. And it says, I like the way you phrase it, many of the world's worst climate records clamour to slather us with their slimy PR, paying out millions accrued from tax avoidance to convince us that they're trying to heal the world rather than plunder and destroy. And you've got various nominees there that people can read about. But it's really entertaining and very informative as well.
Yeah, that's part of the point. It's kind of secret way to get a little bit of knowledge as well whilst you cast your vote. So you are, in theory, supposed there's little drop down menus, and you can read a little bit about the said polluters and why they've worked so hard to earn a nomination for the award. Yeah. And then make your decision there and then based on the information.
As we speak, that when you try to, you can go in and get a wee thumbnail, a bit more information about each of these organisations, like Shell rebranding to Shield for international.
I mean, it's a terrible, terrible farce. I think that's what I voted for. I think in one of the categories, because that was on the slimiest greenwash category. So that's in the UK Polluter Awards. And yeah, Shell for International Women's Day, I think rebranded themselves to Shield. So they put an apostrophe between the E and the two L's.
Very clever, isn't it? Isn't it?
Yeah.
It's sickening, isn't it? I mean, also rather insulting that people can't see through that kind of thing. Could you? You've just mentioned greenwashing there. Could you explain just what greenwashing is? So, and I mean, obviously, companies are increasingly, coming out with their green, in inverted commas, credentials. And actually, to be fair, some of these companies will be making genuine, efforts to move into different areas or run their companies differently. But what is greenwashing?
So it's generally trying to kind of dress yourself in kind of green clothes, whilst simultaneously doing actions that speak nothing towards those that kind of green image that you're projecting. So it's kind of a kind of surface level way to pretend that you're doing stuff and that you care about the climate,
Just sort of lip service while in the opposite, just hypocrisy, really.
Yeah, but it's like it's kind of PR laden lip service, right? So you're like making all this noise and making all this sound about how great you are and how green you are and how much you care about the climate, how much you care about the environment. Whereas like, yeah, what you're doing really under the surface is continuing like fossil fuel extraction or fossil fuel combustion. So we actually did an action at SSE, who are one of the kind of sponsors of COP26. We did it in collaboration with Extinction Rebellion Scotland, and what they did was they blockaded the SSE offices in Peterhead with a greenwashing machine, which was like a really kind of visual way of telling that metaphor.
Very good.
But yeah, there is that sort of thing. Like, see, if you were to like watch, like people say it all the time, if you were to watch like BP's like output, you would think they're like this cozy like green and renewable energy company, and not like a company who are like overwhelmingly, like to the point where it's ridiculous, based in like fossil fuel extraction. So to a certain extent, it probably does filter through, I think. And sponsorship, if we're talking about like COP26, is like one of the ways in which companies can get that license to like, yeah, dress themselves in that green clothes and pretend that they're like part of the solution, when in actual fact they're really causing the problem. And the main reason they do it, of course, is so that like governments don't regulate them and don't tell them what to do, and so they don't have to like avoid any. So they're basically trying to avoid any kind of public scrutiny and public accountability for their actions.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading. Well, it was an article in The Guardian from a while back, but it was about a report that came out a year or two ago. And, you know, it's just basically kind of put the facts together about something like 75% of the increase in carbon emissions is down to about 100 companies over the world. You know, and you think, you know, of course it's a bit naive this, but, you know, a bit you think, well, it's just 100 companies, surely we can cope with that. And of those 25, I think there was something like 25 of them, including folk like BP, Shell, Exxon, the big oil companies. You know, if they carry on doing what they've been doing for the last 30 years, you know, the planet will be, well, the planet won't be destroyed, but humanity's niche on the planet may well go, you know, at the cost of millions and millions of people's lives, disruption, to a certain extent, even, you know, civilization. You begin to think you're living in a Margaret Atwood dystopia novel.
Yeah, and they're like really trying to mess with that. So, like you said, yeah, it's like it's so perilous just now. The situation is so perilous, and it might be that we've already like crossed like tipping points that we just cannot get back from, you know. But the question is how far we want to chance it, you know. And like it seems like that's very much. I mean, from our political class, that's very much a kind of debate that's open. But yeah, like you point out, very few companies are kind of responsible for this. And it's very important also, I mean, we make this point all the time that, you know, you're not personally responsible for like this situation. It's a problem of like power and like often kind of power that's been handed to like malign actors. And like what we need to do is take back that power. Just even to kind of tie in with a bit of the greenwashing stuff you're talking about, like for example, like BP kind of like invented basically like that kind of term carbon footprint that like everyone just says now, without even thinking about. That was kind of like a marketing ploy for them, so that they get like customers or people to like measure their carbon footprint and see how much you can do to like solve the climate crisis. Very, very. I mean, it's so evil, but also like it is a little bit like genius at the same time, because it's worked. You know, everyone says carbon footprint.
Yes, exactly. Just to ask you something else then. So, is the Scottish government involved much in the Glasgow COP, or is it basically, you know, I mean, obviously it's not a devolved area or anything like that.
Yeah, so like there's definitely quite a lot of like politics around that. I mean, in principle, not really. It is like the kind of UK government, or like the presidency. So like all ministers and people involved in like the kind of presidency around the COP are from the UK government. And of course, the UK make kind of their kind of climate disclosures as a kind of UK unit. But again, like that's mostly kind of Westminster based. Yeah. But like the COP, there's almost like kind of 2 points, 2 things that kind of happen at the COP. There's like the kind of agendas that people are kind of trying to. The actual agenda of the COP and the items up for discussion. And then there's also just like the chance for like people to like make statements on the international stage. And like at that level, like the Scottish Government will most definitely be involved because it's just so proximal to like where they're at. So I think they're going to be like hosting like certain spaces in and around the kind of COP venue. And no doubt you'll see like plenty of news of the Scottish Government talking climate in the lead up to the COP and during the COP. And it might actually create the impression that they are very much involved in the process. So they've got agenda, they can influence the agenda and like the kind of the narrative around the Scottish Government to a certain extent around the COP and news.
I think it was, well, it must be 3 or 4 years back now, but when there was a meeting in Poland, a climate meeting in Poland, the First Minister got invited to that. She was on a panel, she's doing a panel discussion. So there's obviously opportunities for them to get involved. But Scotland does have some pretty impressive targets, and they are legally bound by them, aren't they? So I suppose they'll be trying to kind of encourage other people to do that. So do you have any plans? Do you have any plans for action on the ground in Glasgow in November, or is that giving too much away to MI5, who's bound to be listening into this?
Yeah. Almost certainly there'll be plans on the ground at Glasgow. Fortunately, I can't even give it away because I don't know what they're going to be yet. Definitely not that definitely not planned that far ahead. But there very much will be kind of actions happening in Glasgow, and I think we'll be very much a part of that. What they look like, who knows? And there's also just the kind of organising question of like, and this is a question that our group has to like kind of try and work through, is like, how much can we mobilise people? How much can we get people involved in like the climate movement over the next few months so that they feel prepared to take action when COP comes, or take on like a kind of leadership role, for want of a better term, like when COP comes. You hate that term, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So like things will be happening, almost certainly. Yeah. You'll see my little curly head bobbing around somewhere.
Yeah, we look forward to seeing, the sort of creative ideas around demonstrations, actions. If we see somebody dangling from the Finniston crane, we'll keep an eye open to see if it's you, Scott.
I can assure you, my fear of heights will get in the way there.
Hey, that's an idea. A couple of years back, I did a bit of fundraising for a charity in Glasgow, which involved a zip wire across the Clyde from near where that big crane is, right across. You could get people going across with big banners, holding big banners up. I'll do that.
Are you volunteering, Marlene?
Yeah, I'll volunteer.
Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if Boris Johnson zip wired into the COP,
Yeah. Well, hopefully he'll get stuck halfway across the Clyde. holding a Union Jack, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be very uncharacteristic if he got stuck.
So it's been really good talking to you, Scott. And I mean, I've only kind of picked up about the group from this chat, but also from your website. And I think you're doing a lot of good work in there. Actually, it's really impressive way of getting people involved. How do you feel? How about yourself personally? Are you feeling? I don't know. Are you feeling optimistic? Are you not just about COP, but the longer term? Because you're sitting here talking to two old age pensioners, and let's be honest. By the time the worst of this happens, we'll both be out of the picture. We've also got young relatives to think about as well. But how do you feel about it all yourself?
I mean, to be honest, and I don't know if this speaks towards just the way my mind works, but I probably don't carry a great deal of optimism and a great deal of faith in as much as like I don't think the people who have caught, or the political institutions that have continually failed on this issue are going to like solve the crisis. So like say at COP26, like I don't have much faith that we're going to see like the radical change that we need on the climate. But like that kind of, I guess, kind of pessimism towards like our political institutions, I guess, is maybe to a certain extent offset by like the optimism around kind of movement building and like the climate movement across the globe and the climate movement in Scotland, and the potential for change, and like the fact that I think we've seen plenty of little signs of like things just shifting even over the last 5-10 years. I mean, like the reason I'm here to a certain extent was because of the indie ref, and like I got really involved in indie ref as a 22-year-old, and then from there I've just kind of picked it up and kept on going, and so I've got like confidence in like the potential of like movement building change basically, but I mean it's also kind of the situation, as you also said, is like quite dire as we speak, and we shouldn't like avoid how much work we have to do to like make sure we change this, but we've got to challenge the power structures that have caused the crisis, because I mean it's COP26. 26 is the kind of clue to 26 go. We're trying to sort this out,
exactly.
Right?
Yes, exactly.
It's such an important role that your organisation's playing in the raising of awareness and motivating people, and using this opportunity to bring it to the forefront of people's minds, in the light of COVID and the pandemic. A lot of other issues have kind of got pushed to the side. I mean, I was in George Square I was going to say last year, but it's 2 years ago, because you've lost a year of your life, when all the young people were demonstrating it, and it was so inspiring.
It was.
It was fabulous, so thanks.
I was there too.
Were you? Thanks very much for all you're doing, Scott.
Yeah, and thanks for coming in, talking to us. And maybe, come November, we might get back in touch and you can tell us about how things are going.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I really appreciate you folks reaching out and inviting us along. And I'd be more than happy to chat.
Great.
In the future, in November or whenever.
Right. Okay, then.
You can chat to me on the Finnis and Crane. How about
that? Bring the microphone up. Okay, fantastic.
So we're coming to the end of today's Daytime Friday show. Presenters Marlene Halliday and myself, Valerie Gold. We hope you've enjoyed the show, and you've been listening to interviews with Geraldine Clayton from Divest Strathclyde, Councillor Ken Andrew from Glasgow City Council, who's a member of the Management Committee of the Strathclyde Pension Fund, and from Scott Tully, who is from the campaigning group Glasgow Calls Out Polluters. And if you'd like to hear more great music on Indyliveradio, why don't you tune in this evening, Friday at 7 p.m, to hear Steve B's show, which is Music and Musings. Always some great music there. Tomorrow, again, we have at 10 o'clock, from 10 to 1 on Saturday morning, we have the Saturday show with James E. And in the afternoon, a chance to hear again some of our other shows like Steve B and Dr. Dave. Please consult our schedule on our website for full details of all the shows, because there are some really amazing shows. And our music team, Steve Callahan, Fiona McGregor, James Elliott and Jerry Mulvena are adding new shows all the time, like Jerry's great show on a Wednesday at 7, which is Musical Hugs, and also James's show on Thursday evening at 7 o'clock, which is Our Country. So there's all sorts of types of music to suit all sorts of tastes. So have a good look at the schedule, and remember that you can also now access a lot of our shows on Mixcloud, which you can download the app, or you can access it via your browser, but that way you can hear these music shows on demand at any time you like. So I hope you've enjoyed the show. It'll be repeated tomorrow between 7 and 9, that's Saturday the 3rd of July, and we hope you'll tune in again next week for more of the Friday show on indyliveradio. And in the meantime, this is Valerie Gold closing the show and wishing you a really great weekend.
Indyliveradio, the daytime show. Indyliveradio, the daytime show. Indyliveradio.